The connection between suicide and serial killers is an interesting one. On the surface, one may think, "Oh, these are individuals who be very prone to ending their own life, considering what they did." But that's not really always the case. In fact, it's quite often not nearly the case. Joining us to discuss this interesting observation, Dr. Katherine Ramsland is joining us. Thank you so much for being here. It's always an honor to be talking with you and getting your insight on things like this. Catherine, let's just start out at the beginning. What common psychological traits have you observed among serial killers who actually do commit suicide? And let's talk about how likely it is that one actually does carry that out.
Well, first, I will say a lot of people think all serial killers are alike, and they're not. There's a lot of diversity among them in terms of their personalities, their disorders, their motivations, even the way they kill people and why. So, of course, there's going to be differences among their reasons for killing themselves. Now, one thing I'll say, being a suicidologist, is that a lot of times people don't give their motivations, and only about at most 25% even leave notes, and in the notes they hardly give their motivations, almost never. So um, we're speculating, and here and there we have some who made it very clear why they're doing this. So there's a range of responses to them being investigated. About 5% kill themselves before they're even identified. There was one in France, I think last year, the year before, who killed himself. He was a former police officer, and then it turned out that he confessed to several murders at the same time that people had not linked to him. So here and there, you'll have that. Sometimes they'll kill themselves as an investigation is getting close, and they think they're going to be apprehended, or they are apprehended, like Leonard Lake, and he was ready, killed himself as soon as he was arrested. Or they kill themselves very quickly in prison while they're awaiting their trial. Sometimes they will wait until they're convicted and kill themselves fairly soon after that. Some will wait a few years after they're convicted to kill themselves.
Yeah.
And some will go serve out their sentence, but maybe they'll get some kind of condition like cancer, which is probably what happened with Ted Kaczynski, and they'll decide they want to end it, like people in ordinary life will maybe do the same thing for the same reason. So there's a lot of variations on why they're doing this. A few have expressed remorse, so it's their conscience that leads the way. A few have said they will never, like Jack Unterweger, an Austrian serial killer, said he'll never spend another day in prison. He had been freed because he was a writer, and the Viennese literati believed art had cured him. He went on to kill 11 people, and he was convicted, and he had sworn he would never spend another day in prison. So he committed suicide as a way to exercise control.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of variation on the motivations.
When we talk about those motivations, and I was wondering about that, is it in a majority of cases or a higher percentage of cases more so them exercising their control, if you will, versus actual remorse for the crime or being overtaken by guilt or anything of that nature?
Yeah, the ones who have expressed remorse are really low percentage. Doesn't mean some of the others don't feel remorse. It just means we only know if they've expressed it in some kind of note or said it to somebody. And that's, for example, there was one, Mac Ray Edwards, who was murdering children, and he turned himself in, and he wanted the death penalty. And he tried to commit suicide twice in prison before he was convicted. And even getting the death penalty, didn't want to wait. So he ended up committing suicide. And he did talk about his remorse and his feeling that he's a monster. There have been a few like that, but they are in the minority.
When we talk about remorse, is their definition of remorse something far different than what we would think of when we think of remorse? Meaning, is there remorse more so I got myself in this sort of trouble and now I'm unhappy because I'm behind bars, or is it remorse truly for the victims and the lives that they took?
Well, it's the same thing we mean with the difference between remorse and regret.
Yeah,
It's the
yeah.
same thing. We might regret we've done something that got us into a trap, or we made a mistake, versus being really sorry about it. So same for them.
Mhm.
And I couldn't tell you how deeply they feel because I don't know. I don't know how deeply anybody feels. I can only tell from what language they use and what behavior they use. So I think there certainly are some who regret it. So you will see something like Leonard Lake immediately killing himself, or Fred West killing himself right away. No remorse there. Just, I'm not going to go to prison.
Yeah,
And I
control.
regret that I'd made a mistake that got me caught.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Is there any correlation between the methods in which they ended for themselves? Guns, hanging, all of that.
It's typically shooting or hanging. That's quite often. Often they will have guns. So if they think the law is approaching, they'll use that. In prison, they don't have a gun, so hanging is the next best thing. Typically, occasionally you'll have, like Richard Trenton Chase had medications because he had schizophrenia, and so he hoarded them and then overdosed. So occasionally you'll have somebody with the means to do it that way, but the most often we see is shooting and hanging.
Often when we think about serial killers, think about cold, calculated individuals who have no empathy, no real emotion for others. So the idea of them killing themselves, kind of like the idea of a narcissist killing themselves, it's not super common. When we're talking about it, though, and we're trying to get to the root of why some do and why some don't, is there anything in their background that correlates to this in terms of upbringing or mindset or something that maybe makes that a different duck than the others?
Yeah, I think we do see in the backgrounds of some of those serial killers who committed suicide, psychiatric issues in the home. So, in other words, mental instability with the parents, or some kind of mismanagement that really is psychiatrically based. And they're also the ones, if they're sexually compelled, because not all serial killers are, if they're sexually compelled, they're also the ones who often commit the most deviant or extreme acts. So they have mental instability in their background. And I just want to say something about the whole notion of they have no empathy.
Okay.
They do actually, they can experience what people are feeling, but they just don't care, because they are the center of the world. But narcissists will commit suicide if they want to exert one last way to keep control over their situation, because that's a narcissistic suicide. I am going to be the one who makes that determination. So you'll definitely find suicide with narcissists for that reason.
Mhm. When you have individuals like this, and some write notes, some do not, it seems far fewer actually do write any sort of insight as to why they're taking that sort of action. Can anything be gained from those notes? I mean, are these simply the writings of someone in their own world, someone like an Israel Keys or something of that nature?
Well, the guy in France, Barabé, he wrote in his suicide note, wrote about some of the cases that he was guilty of. So yeah, and in fact, with Israel Keys, they did hope that he was going to leave some code or some message about these victims that he hadn't named. And Keys was an interesting one because he was really playing a game with law enforcement. Once he was caught, he was trying to be Ted Bundy without making Bundy's mistakes, and yet he made some mistakes that were actually similar to Bundy. So when he was caught, he wanted to make a deal that, because he didn't want his daughter to know what he had done, and so he didn't want any this to get into the media, which was kind of ignorant on his part. And he said, if you will assure me I can be executed within a year, I will give you, there are 8 more victims, and I will tell you their names. All they knew about was 3 because those 3 were on his computer. And I think they could, honestly, I think they could have just said, okay, we'll
Sure.
do that, get the names, and then say, oh, you know what? Turns out we actually can't do that.
Yeah.
What's he going to do? But anyway, that's not how it happened.
Yeah.
So when they kept hedging and saying, no, we can't really deliver on that, and tried to get the information from him in a different way, he just decided this is it and maneuvered his way into getting a razor blade that he should have never had. And then he wrote this 3-page suicide note, some of it in blood, and also made faces that he left behind that maybe were representative of his victims, but we don't really know because he didn't explain them and he didn't actually explain himself. He ranted in this letter. He used it as sort of a platform, um, didn't really give any information. So it reveals some things to us about his state of mind and his narcissism and the kind of game he was playing. So that helps criminology, but it didn't help law enforcement with any clues about where his victims were, who they were, or if there were any others.
Mhm. Why is it that we seem to see, and we're talking, I mean, about different types of killers here a little bit when we're talking about a mass shooter or something of that nature versus a serial killer. In the end, both end up taking out a lot of people, but in very different means. Oftentimes, in mass shootings, we do see someone taking their life immediately after. What's the difference in that type of mindset and personality versus your Ted Bundys versus your BTKs and things like that?
Well, about 37% of mass murders are overtly suicidal, versus 6.6% of serial killers. So
Sure.
that's a big difference. And
Yeah.
they've already decided they want to end their life. So it's something we call coercive suicide.
Okay.
They want to end their life and they want to take people with them. Sometimes it's about punishing or leaving a big statement, or they think they're going to be the world's worst mass murderer, because they want to be somebody rather than nobody. So we do have a variety of motivations, but their acting out as mass murderers are an extension of their suicidal impulse. So that's very different from much of what we see with serial killers. In fact, I don't even know of a serial killer who is murdering out of a suicidal impulse. I don't think I've ever seen that.
Sure. No, that does make a lot of sense. When we're talking about these types of individuals and the differences in them, like that between a mass murderer, a serial killer, what are some of the specifically on serial killers? What are some of the public's misconceptions about these individuals when they think they try to understand what they did, why they do these sort of things, and like I was saying earlier on, the thought that they're they're likely to kill themselves because of remorse and guilt. What are some of the other misconceptions that
Well,
others have out
I
there?
mean, the main misperception is that they're all alike, and
Yeah.
and we have, over 5,000 serial killers documented. They're not all alike. There's a big difference. There's a whole spectrum of personality uh, manifestations among serial killers. Some will have remorse. Some have turned themselves in. Very few, but some have. Some just are killing. Some are psychologically handicapped in some way. They don't even realize what they're doing or don't have any sense that what they're doing is wrong.
Mhm.
So they're not all psychopaths.
Yeah.
Uh, and even the psychopathic ones have a variety of motivations as well. So that's one of the problems. I actually wrote a blog once. I say the number one question I get asked about serial killers is it nature, is it nurture?
Oh, yeah.
As if we can measure, and as if it matters whether we measure, because it doesn't. But each person is different in their response to whatever is happening in their life in terms of turning it toward violence, let alone serial violence. And they're going to all have different measures of how much is this genetics versus things that happen to them and how they process their world. It's a lot about perception and what they, maybe entitlement in some cases. So the idea that there's this uniformity and that there's this profile of a serial killer that you can measure people against is just erroneous. And unfortunately, that comes from a lot of fiction, and it's out there and it sticks in people's minds because it simplifies the picture for them, and it's just not the way it is.
Yeah, I mean, we're always searching for answers and trying to make sense of these sort of things, but unfortunately, you can't make a lot of sense of them. When you study these type of individuals and how they are all so different, obviously, it's very interesting to go into the individual minds of all of these different people. But what what does that research end up telling us, and how does that help us in the future in terms of trying to identify individuals like this? Again, being that they're all so vastly different.
Well, it depends on the kind of research
Mhm.
you're setting up. There's something called script theory, where you're trying to, and this is part of the FBI's prison program, where they would go in and interview offenders to try to figure out what were the antecedents to their crime, was their fantasy life in some cases, what were they thinking about, how did they plan it, how did they pull it off, what happened, what do they feel afterward, how do they treat victims during a crime and afterward. So you want to develop this entire script of what they did from inception to completion and afterward, and then you put that together with other such narratives to try to make comparisons so that you can maybe look at early triggers or situations that seem to be common among them, so that maybe there can be some intervention programs, especially with family dynamics, because often it's about family dynamics and it's about rejection or neglect or abuse of some kind in the family home.
Yeah.
So identifying, where people kind of went off the rails. And I just had a guy come to me and say he had watched my documentary that's, I think, currently on Hulu, about the BTK
Yeah.
killer that I spent 5 years talking to write his story.
Sure.
So that's script theory right there. That's a good example of what I was doing. And he came and said, I wonder how many people are like me, where during my adolescence, I probably would have become a serial killer, because I was trying to rid myself of the shame that I felt from my mother's rejection of me being gay. And so I had all these fantasies of murdering men, because it was a way to purge myself of this awful, awful thing. And then as I grew up, and moved away and went to college, I started having experiences with people who accepted me, and I felt less and less anger and the urge to kill people. And so I never did become a serial killer, but maybe, yeah, I would have, had I had a way to. He says, I did purchase a knife. I did have all these fantasies of what I was going to do, but I had limited means of transportation and ways to meet these people that I intended to kill. So that's interesting because he saw within that documentary, oh, I see where I was almost a serial killer. Had I had the means to do so, I might have done that, except for something else that came across my path that diminished those urges. So I think that there are more people like that. He's not the only one who's contacted me to talk about something like that. And that's valuable information because now we can pinpoint some of the things that go on in the lives of, in particularly adolescent males, and that can help us with interventions.
How can people intervene? I mean, with the signs, obviously, we're in a world where quite often nothing is going to happen until somebody actually commits a crime. It's impossible to predict who's going to be a serial killer or not, or a murderer or something of that nature. With being able to learn these things and seeing those red flags, um, how can intervention happen before the actual crime is committed? If you know, unless there's a threat letter or something of that nature or threats being made.
Well, I wouldn't say it's impossible to predict because we do have a lot of red flags
Yeah.
in people's lives, and we do have programs with adolescents at risk of becoming adult psychopaths, where we have seen the ways they've developed into potentially violent individuals. So I wouldn't say it's impossible.
Mhm.
It's hard and time consuming and expensive,
Sure.
um, but but we're making strides. So I don't think it's as hopeless as that kind of sounds.
Sure.
We have lists of things in common in their backgrounds that can assist us, and doesn't mean if somebody's um, you know arming themselves and angry and venting that they're definitely going to act out, but the chances are better that they would act out than somebody who doesn't have any of those things in their background. So damaging fire setting. Now the whole idea of the McDonald triad is terrible. The idea that animal cruelty, fire setting, and bedwetting will tell us that somebody's going to be a serial killer. There's absolutely no research support for that at all. It was an idea that a guy named McDonald, and he didn't invent the restaurants, but had, and he was a psychiatrist, and he did some studies of patients that he was seeing, and sort of thought, well, maybe this is going to help, but nobody was able to replicate his work such that these became good predictors. However, certainly if they have animal cruelty and other destructive acts in their background, and a few of the other things that we've seen by studying children and adolescents who are at risk, then you can do interventions with them.
Mhm.
It's
Let's t-
really similar to what's going on with the school shooters.
yeah.
There are programs now. There are ways to identify angry kids who might come back and shoot the school. Not that we can catch them all. Obviously, we can't. But there have been a number of them that have been stopped, that unless you know the literature, you don't know about them. But
Sure.
they've been stopped because we do have intervention programs.
How well equipped are we with programs like this for just the knowledge for teachers, for administrators, and people like that to be able to
I don't know.
identify
I
things
don't know.
like
I
that?
came on to talk about suicide, so I don't know. I don't know. I'm not a sociologist, and I'm not a clinical
Sure.
psychologist, so I couldn't begin to tell you how
Yeah.
well we're doing with that. I do know there are people who are experts in these fields, who are in clinical work, who have made a difference in diverting somebody from the path of violence to something more pro-social.
Okay. Ted Kaczynski is another interesting one. One that took a long time for him to actually kill himself, but it does seem like that had more to do more with health than it did anything else, and making the choice to end his life before things got worse for him physically. Let's talk about time for a little bit, where we do have some of these where once they're caught, once they're getting ready to be caught, and the end is near, we see that happen. But then you have some of these that are in prison for quite some time. Health, I can understand a little bit more, but others that just live their life for a long time, there's nothing really changing in their environment or their future. Why do some seem to wait for such a long period of time before actually doing an act like that?
It's different reasons. I know Harold Shipman waited 4 years so that his wife could collect his pension. So that, because I guess there was some kind of suicide clause, and so he waited
Mhm.
and then finally hanged himself. And supposedly the next guy in the cell claimed that Shipman came and haunted the cell as a ghost. I don't know. I thought that was kind of a funny story, but he had a very clearly calculated plan as to when he was going to end his life to benefit his wife. So that was one. Another one who waited, where it wasn't really about health, was this guy in France that I mentioned. And also the one that sparked the blog that we're talking about, the bike path killer, um, took a while before he did. I don't know that he gave a reason why he did,
Mhm.
but he took a while. Typically, if they're going to commit suicide, it'll be within a few months to a year because they despair of wanting to be in prison. That's not where they just see the endlessness. There's no hope of ever getting out, no parole possibilities, and they just want to end this kind of thing. There was one, Michael Ross, who didn't commit suicide, but he insisted that they carry out his execution. And he didn't want any appeals. He wanted this to move along. So that's, some people would say that's a form of suicide, where he's just, I don't want to be here any longer than I have to. You've already decided to execute me, and this was the state of Connecticut, and they didn't really want to actually carry it out, but he forced their hand. And there are a lot of people who would call that suicidal, and maybe it was. He's not the only one who's done that, who's just said, "You made this decision. Let's get it done."
Do we ever see in the prison system individuals who are trying to carry out a very similar form of suicide, almost suicide by cop, or even suicide by other inmates, getting yourself in a situation where others are going to target you and take you out because maybe you don't have the means to do it yourself?
Well, I don't know about in prison,
Hmm.
but Paul John Knowles, when he was being transported, he made a grab for an officer's gun, knowing that it was very unlikely he was going to survive that because he was in their car. So it
Sure.
was very unlikely he was going to survive that. So I think that he was trying to do a suicide by cop. Um, I, I, I know that some serial killers have been murdered in prison, like Jeffrey Dahmer, for
Hmm.
example. Dahmer didn't. There wasn't anything about Dahmer that suggested he was willing to be killed by somebody. I mean, he had recently been baptized. Um, no, I think that he didn't do that. And the other ones that I know about, I don't think they set it up where they would be shanked by somebody just because they wanted to get it over with. More often, you're going to see them doing something like coiling their sheet. Like Israel Keys did this interesting way. He coiled up his sheet, tied it around his neck and his foot, cut his wrist, and as he's bleeding out, which isn't necessarily a guaranteed way of killing yourself, as he lost consciousness from the loss of blood, the sheet tightened
Hmm.
and strangled him. So interesting, different. So more often they're going to be doing something like that than
Hmm.
trying to set somebody up to kill them.
How interesting. Very fascinating conversation, Dr. Katherine Ramsland. Thank you so much for coming on and giving us your insight on this and your blog with that article. Very, very fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey, it's Tony Brueski. If you want more of our interview with our guests, be sure to check out our podcast, Hidden Killers with Tony Brueski. Just search that wherever you download podcasts and press subscribe. Also, you can check out our YouTube channel for the full video version of the interviews as well, under the same name, Hidden Killers with Tony Brueski. Check it out, subscribe, binge, and enjoy. Thanks for watching.